Brett, I love Shawn Baker. Tangerine, one of my favorite movies of all time. So going into Anora, won the Palme d'Or. The buzz is out the wazoo. I had very, very high expectations walking in, and Anora cleared that bar easily. Anora really shows Shawn Baker's mastery over storytelling, character work, theme, and camera work. I loved the acting in this movie. I loved Mikey Madison's performance, and I loved all the supporting cast. Particularly, shout out to the gentleman who played the young Vanya. Mm-hmm. Very funny, needle-threading performance that was absolutely wonderful. But this is Mikey's show, and she murdered it.
And that's Mark Eidelstein.
Mark Eidelstein. I love this movie is so upbeat and colorful in the beginning and for the first act while Honora's feeling great. And then it switches over and it looks very like electric and alive and beautiful. And then it switches over to the cool muted tones in Act 2, both of which pair beautifully and look amazing. I absolutely loved the camera and the camera work. It felt effortlessly natural. It felt super... you didn't even notice how much that camera was moving. And in some of the more difficult to shoot scenes, including the, if not famous now, soon to be famous 28-minute long Act 2 scene, incredibly difficult to shoot. Plus, like, think about those gigantic windows in that house and the way that they had to, it was 10 days they shot that with only 7 hours of daylight because they were trying to shoot in the wintertime because Anora happens in the winter. And for them to pull off that scene and make it seem so seamless and effortless, like it just happened over the course of a true 28 minutes, I thought that was brilliant. I thought the script was wonderful. I love the ballsiness of the structure. And I love Shawn Baker's New York. I love Coney Island on film. I love Brighton Beach on film and the elevated subway in that part of Brooklyn. I love Shawn Baker's look at his strip club. I love his Vegas. I love the tenderness with which he treats his characters, with the realism that he treats his characters. And I think this is another great Shawn Baker movie. It's not my favorite Shawn Baker movie, but I think this is just another great movie. Tonally, very funny. Also very sad. I fell in love with Anora every minute as the movie went on, and as time has gone on after seeing the movie, think back fondly on that character. Very strong, interesting, funny character. So overall, a unique movie. A lot of great Russian stuff, Russian Brooklyn stuff. A lot of that was great. Complicated high wire act tonally and thematically, especially between sort of the high highs of the Vegas stuff and the low lows of Coney Island and such. And I just think, I watched it after they gave it the Palme d'Or, and everyone's been saying it's the greatest thing since sliced bread for 6 months, and I still loved it and was charmed, and I thought it was pretty darn masterful. I don't know if it's my favorite movie of the year or my favorite Shawn Baker movie, but I know that this was a work of high craft by an excellent team.
Yeah, same with me. Literally the only bad thing I can say about Anora, the only critique, is that it's not my favorite Shawn Baker movie. That would still be The Florida Project for me, but that's such a high bar, and this movie fits so well into his filmography and does a couple interesting little moves that I think are an evolution of his style and an evolution of his storytelling. It's so good. Everybody has to see it. Mikey Madison is fantastic, like you said, in the lead role. Just a fearless, hilarious roller coaster of a performance. Should definitely get her an Oscar nomination at the very least. And she, not to dwell on the nudity and the sex and everything, but she said something interesting in an interview with the New York Times last week, where she was saying that she was always comfortable with the nudity and the sex scenes because quote, Anora was too. Anora was comfortable with them too, and there was never a thought in my head to be nervous or anything. And so the reason I bring this up is because I think it gets at what is actor's going to act, but in this movie,
I'm saying she's an actor's actor.
An actor's actor, exactly,
Sorry,
exactly. And I think it points at what's so great about the performance is that it's one of those performances where she knows that she's killing it. You can tell that she knows that she is perfectly suited to the character. She knows that everything is clicking. She knows that all her instincts are right. She just knows that she's found her perfect character, and so that gives it just a propulsion of this dynamic, fearless performance. All comes out of the fact that she doesn't think of, it's an actory thing to say, but I think in this movie it really is true that she just doesn't think of herself as separate from the character. Like, she's comfortable in the sex scenes because Anora is comfortable in the sex scenes, and I am Anora, and the performance has that sort of confidence to it and that fearlessness to it. It's also interesting in this movie that Shawn Baker didn't use an intimacy coordinator for the movie, which has become, industry standard since Me Too. And obviously would not recommend this as a general rule. You don't want David O. Russell being his own intimacy coordinator. But in the case of Shawn Baker, this is a guy who all his movies are about sex workers. One of his missions as a filmmaker seems to be to humanize sex work and sex workers. He's friends with sex workers. He knows the world. And so in this isolated case, it seemed like it really benefited the movie. And I'm wondering if that's where, the sex scenes and the more intense scenes got their sort of realism and intensity and resonance from, is that Shawn Baker probably is better at being an intimacy coordinator for his own movies than an industry standard intimacy coordinator, because he knows how to talk to the actors about the scenes. He knows the characters so well. He knows how to get them comfortable with it without sort of ruining the mystique and the dynamism that he's trying to create in these scenes. And so again, not recommending that as a general rule. You don't want Todd Phillips being his own intimacy coordinator. Probably don't want Luca being his own intimacy coordinator.
Oh, come on.
And this is nothing again. I'm just saying. There's different types of directors, and in this unique case, it feels like it benefited the movie to have Shawn Baker, play the role of the intimacy coordinator, and that also I think is what contributed to Mikey Madison having just the confidence and the fearlessness to play this character and play this role. Shawn Baker's writing and directing are just at peak form here. The movie is so funny; it humanizes every single character. There's a moment where these three Russian handlers that are like sort of mob adjacent, they seem like sort of mob archetypes, different points in the hierarchy, like the kind of like a kind of guy who's sort of at the corporate level, a guy who's sort of in the middle, and then just the sort of like tough guy henchman at the bottom. But then Shawn Baker sort of effortlessly, but also with such detail, gives each character their own arc, their own identity. He never writes off anybody. He never lets anyone disappear into archetype. He never like just lets the archetype do the work, or let the sort of stock character do the work. He always humanizes everybody, makes every character feel relatable, usually because he just has them like make mistakes and have accidents and get hurt, and so then they have to show you their humanity as a result of that. And I think that's why Shawn Baker is emerging among the sort of great contemporary directors. I think Shawn Baker is emerging as our great humanist, because it seems like with a lot of the great directors working now, from Tarantino to PTA to even like Damien Chazelle, like the competition is over like virtuosity, whereas Baker isn't really concerned with virtuosity in the way that a lot of these particularly male directors are. He really is a humanist at heart, whose concern is for the characters and for the story, and almost as like bringing it down as much as he can, bringing it down to the human level, to the relatable level, to the resonant level. And I think it just has created a really unique filmography, of which Anora is definitely a high point, even if it's not my favorite of the filmography. And he does that through this incredible mix of comedy and a plot that is high stakes but also grounded and relatable. And I think most importantly to what the filmography he's crafting, he's always interested in these characters at the margins of society, characters who usually are at some kind of socioeconomic disadvantage, in some state of financial desperation. And because of that, in addition to becoming like our great humanist, I think Shawn Baker's legacy is going to be that he is the great cinematic storyteller of late stage global capitalism. That he is telling stories that are never explicitly political or overtly political. They're never burdened down by heavy-handedness, but man, are they telling the story of this period of human history, and are they telling it so well? I think, he is the 20th century version of Charles Dickens or George Eliot or Steinbeck, like artists whose main concern was the relationship between individual and society. They were concerned with the way in which, macroeconomics and power and exploitation and corruption and bigotry all combined to sort of create the playing field of our existence. And we have to play on this like wobbly, uneven, unfair fucked up playing field of late stage global capitalism. And his stories all sort of bring that to life in such an interesting way that does what art should do, which is showing that world, but putting your focus on the human beings who are sort of have to live in that world and don't get to be the puppeteers of the world. The puppeteers of Anora you see for 2 seconds in a private office at like a private airfield at the very end of the movie. You finally see like the puppeteers, the Russian oligarch and his wife. But the movie is barely concerned with them. The movie is concerned with the people who have to be the puppets of the puppeteers and them living their lives and trying to sort of cut their strings and fight against the powers that be. But ultimately are as much as they rage, the movies are always pretty honest about like, you can't win this game. Like the game is over. The game has been won by the oligarchs and the billionaires, and you're going to lose. But he humanizes the losers of global capitalism, I think, in such interesting and beautiful ways. And I think he really is slowly but surely, without trying to play someone else's game, I think slowly but surely he really is emerging. Shawn Baker is as one of the great contemporary filmmakers, one of the great filmmakers of the 21st century, and without trying to play the game of virtuosity. And look, God bless the virtuosos. I can't wait for the brutalist. But Shawn Baker is going to do what Shawn Baker does, which is 90 to 120 minute humanist stories that are funny and compelling and tragic and sad all in one. And
he finds plenty of grandeur and massiveness in those small moments. Yeah.
And he had a line in an interview last week where he was kind of joking about like, here comes another Shawn Baker sex work movie, and kind of joking about the fact that he sort of stays in this one lane in terms of the characters and the stories he's telling. But then he had another line that I really liked where he said, he's like, but look, he's like, as long as my focus is just telling a good story. And if I tell a good story, I think the audiences will forgive me the repetition. And I would say, Shawn, not only do I forgive it, I encourage it, because it is your consistency and your focus that is building a real legacy of work, and not just this sense of someone sort of drifting aimlessly between projects. I mean, you're building a body of work, and the consistency is part of that. And there are also ways that Anora, I think, evolves his style in really interesting ways. Yeah. I mean, the big thing that makes it unique is I like how he jumps between geographical locations for each movie and like feels like he has lived forever in those locations, because he gives you such detail, such underbelly of these places where, Tangerine was East Hollywood, Florida Project, obviously Orlando, Red Rocket, Texas City, Galveston, that south of Houston area. And then Anora is his New York movie. We got a Shawn Baker New York movie, which can't be
a great New York movie.
Like I kind of wasn't expecting that. So much of the focus in the trailer was like Mikey Madison and all the like. This is Shawn Baker's New York movie. He gets to be Scorsese and Abel Ferrara and Susan Seidelman all wrapped up in one. He gets to give us Brooklyn, Brighton Beach.
Well, he really does the French Connection in the second half.
Yes,
it's like,
yes.
It really is like that muted gangster, cool toned 70s aesthetic.
It's so great. And the other thing that I see Baker sort of evolving here with Anora is that, unlike some of his previous characters, particularly Florida Project and Red Rocket, Anora doesn't have as much leeway to live in the fantasy version of her life. She of course has like her week with the rich kid, and she gets to go to Vegas and party and be rich by proxy. But then the whole second half of the movie, and man, what a thrill it was when you get to the like 45-minute mark of this movie and you're like, holy shit, I've seen every scene from the trailer. I have no idea what the second half of this movie is going to be. I have no idea. I love that feeling. And in the second half of the movie, Annie really has to just confront the reality of her life and live in the reality of her life. And even though she rages against it and tries to fight against it and tries to fight against this sort of this being exploited and getting everything given to her and then taken from her at sort of at the whims of the rich, she really has to, through the end of the movie, just live in the reality of her life. And she doesn't get that escape into fantasy that, Florida Project and Red Rocket both end with these scenes where the character is allowed to sort of escape into the fantasy version of their lives. And of course he's doing that to show you how fake the fantasy version is, because it's not, it doesn't bear any resemblance to what we've seen leading up to it in the movie. But in Anora, it was interesting for her not to get that escape into fantasy at any point, in the second half of the movie, that she just has to ultimately confront the reality of all this. I really liked that. It felt like an evolution of his style. And last shout out would be to Yura Borisov, who plays Igor, which is, at first he seems like maybe the most insignificant character. I mean, there's no insignificant characters in Shawn Baker movies, but he feels like he's the least significant. He's going to have the least to do, the least lines. He's like the tough guy of the three Russian handlers that show up. But then in these shots, there's these shots where like he and Anora will be in the same shot, and she's out of focus and he's in focus, and you start to be like, and he's not saying anything, he's just listening, because he's just there to get physical if things need to get physical. But you're like, what is Shawn doing? Why is he focusing on the little tough guy? But he's like really listening carefully, and then out of that he builds the Russian henchman, the tough guy, into arguably the second most important character in the movie, and he does it step by step, slow step by slow step. But for everyone just wants to get rid of Anora. This henchman ends up being the only guy who like is interested in Anora and cares about her in any way, and wants to know more about her and sort of help her, and like wants and just the way that character emerges and goes from what seems like a supporting character into a main character is amazing and fascinating, and really gives the second half of the movie like its spine, and it gives it a spine around which Mikey Madison can give her big performance, which is so great. So loved Anora. Everybody's got to see it.